I've been leaving food at the edge of the forest for 40 years now, every full moon without fail, and I reckon it's time somebody knew why. My name's not important, what matters is what I've seen, what I've known, and what I've kept silent about since I was a boy of 9 years old standing beside my grandfather. In the pre-dawn cold, he never told me what we were feeding, not at first, just that it had to be done and it had to be me who learned. We'd walk through the frost-stiffened grass carrying a canvas sack, our breath making ghosts in the air, and he'd place the offering on a flat stone worn smooth by decades of this same ritual. Venison mostly, sometimes elk, always raw and always respectfully arranged, like we were setting a table for an honored guest we'd never sit beside. My grandfather's hands would tremble as he worked, and I remember thinking it was the cold. But now I know better. It was something closer to reverence. Or maybe fear so old it had transformed into something else entirely. He'd whisper words I couldn't quite hear, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or apology. And then we'd walk back without looking over our shoulders. That was the one rule he made clear from the very beginning: never look back until you reach the house, no matter what you hear. And there were always sounds, rustling and breathing, and the crack of branches that seemed too deliberate to be wind. The first time I saw the gray walker, I broke that rule, and it changed everything I thought I understood about the world. I was alone that morning because my grandfather had taken ill, and he'd looked at me with such urgency from his bed that I knew the ritual couldn't wait. So I went by myself, terrified but determined, carrying that familiar weight through the darkness before dawn. I placed the meat exactly as I'd been taught, my hands clumsy with nervousness, and as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low sound that was almost a growl but softer, more questioning. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something else, some deeper curiosity or foolish courage, made me turn my head. It stood at the tree line, maybe 30 yards distant, and my mind struggled to make sense of what my eyes were showing me. Taller than any man, broader through the shoulders than seemed possible, covered in gray fur that caught the emerging light like smoke given form. Its face was wolf-like, but wrong, too intelligent, too expressive, and when our eyes met I felt a jolt of recognition that made no logical sense. I should have been paralyzed with terror, should have run screaming back to the house, but instead I felt something stranger, a kind of understanding passing between us. Wordless and ancient, it didn't move toward me, didn't bare its teeth or crouch to spring, just stood there watching with eyes that seemed weighted with centuries. Then it lowered its head, almost like a nod, and melted back into the forest so smoothly it might have been made of morning mist. I ran home, shaking, and told my grandfather everything, expecting anger or disbelief, but instead he just closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He looked older in that moment than I'd ever seen him, like he'd been carrying a burden so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. He made me promise not to speak of it to anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not anyone who wasn't ready to share the weight of knowing. The years passed and I kept that promise, kept the ritual, and my grandfather grew frailer, but he never explained why we did what we did. It wasn't until he was dying, really dying, that winter when the snow piled higher than the barn roof, that he finally told me the truth. His voice was barely a whisper, his grip on my hand surprisingly strong for someone so close to leaving this world. What he said that night by lamplight, with the wind howling outside like it was trying to claw its way in, that's when I understood that some debts span generations, that some agreements are written not in words but in survival, in the thin line between civilization and the wild darkness that surrounds it, always watching, always waiting, always remembering. My grandfather told me our family made a pact 100 years ago, maybe more, back when his own grandfather was caught in a blizzard that should have killed him. The old stories say he'd gone hunting and lost his way when the storm came down like a curtain, dropping, temperatures falling so fast his breath froze in his beard. He'd stumbled through white blindness until he couldn't feel his feet anymore, couldn't remember which direction led home, and that's when he fell into a ravine and knew he was finished. But something found him there in that frozen grave, something that should have seen easy prey but instead did something impossible. It sheltered him, kept him warm through that endless night with its own body, led him home when dawn finally broke gray and weak over the snow-buried world. My grandfather said his grandfather never spoke of what saved him, except to say it wasn't entirely animal and it wasn't asking for gratitude, just acknowledgement, just to be seen and remembered. So the offerings began, a way of saying we haven't forgotten, we honor what you did, we recognize the debt. Generation after generation, The ritual passed down like an inheritance of obligation, and with it came an unspoken peace that settled over our land like a protective hand. The Grey Walker became part of our lives in the way the mountains were, in the way the seasons were constant, powerful, and never to be taken for granted. I was 14 when I saw the Grey Walker for the second time, and that encounter taught me that what stood at the edge of our property was far more than any natural creature, no matter how strange or powerful. It happened during the autumn of my worst year, when my mother had just passed, and my father had retreated so far into his grief he barely spoke anymore, leaving me to tend the livestock and maintain the rituals my grandfather had entrusted to me. Before his own death, 2 winters prior, I'd been going through the motions of life without really living it, and that night I carried the offering with a numbness that felt like armor against feeling anything at all. But when I placed the meat on that ancient stone and turned to leave, I found the Grey Walker standing closer than I'd ever seen it before, maybe 15 feet away, its massive form blocking the path back home. My heart seized with primal fear, every muscle locking as those yellow gold eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to look straight through skin and bone into whatever lay beneath. But it didn't advance, didn't threaten, and as my initial panic began to subside, I noticed something that changed everything. It was holding something in its clawed hands, cradling it with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so fearsome. The object was small and dark against its gray fur, and it took me a long moment to recognize it as a carved wooden horse, child-sized and worn smooth with age, my grandfather's work. I realized with a shock that felt like ice water down my spine he'd been a talented woodcarver and had made toys for me when I was young, including a little horse, exactly like this one that I'd lost years ago during a walk in the woods. The creature held it out toward me, not aggressively, but almost carefully, like an offering of its own, and I understood then that it had been watching us far more closely than I'd ever imagined, collecting pieces of our lives. Remembering, I stepped forward on trembling legs and took the horse from its massive palm, our fingers nearly touching, and the contact was electric, filling me with images I couldn't quite grasp. Snow and fire, running through darkness, standing watch over something terrible and necessary. The Grey Walker made a sound deep in its chest, not quite a growl and not quite a rumble, but something that felt like language stripped down to its emotional essence, conveying meaning beyond words. It lifted one clawed hand and pointed deliberately toward the deeper forest, then back to me, then to the ground beneath our feet, the gesture so clearly intentional that I felt my understanding of the world crack and reform. Around this impossible moment, I realized then that everything I'd been taught about the division between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, between intelligence and instinct, was far simpler than the truth standing before me in the moonlight. The Grey Walker wasn't operating on mere animal cunning or territorial behavior. There was thought behind those eyes, purpose and memory, and something that looked painfully like loneliness. It touched its chest with one clawed hand, then swept that same hand outward toward the mountains, the gesture encompassing everything beyond the boundary of human settlement. And I understood it was showing me its domain, its responsibility, the weight it carried. Then it touched the ground between us, the earth that marked the border between its world and mine, and tapped it 3 times with a deliberateness that felt like ritual, like emphasis, like teaching. The message was becoming clear in a way that bypassed language entirely. It was showing me that it stood between, that it guarded, that it held a line against something I couldn't see, but could suddenly feel pressing against the edges of awareness like a darkness beyond darkness. When it looked at me again, I saw recognition there, saw it acknowledge that I was beginning to understand, and for the first time I wondered if the offerings we'd been leaving all these years were less about appeasing a dangerous creature and more about maintaining contact with a guardian we'd be lost without. The Grey Walker stepped back then, giving me space to leave, but before I turned away, it did something that haunts me still in its simple profundity. It pressed one massive hand to its chest, then extended that same hand toward me, palm open, in what could only be described as a gesture of respect between equals, not master and servant, not predator and prey, not monster and victim, but 2 beings bound by something older than any of those simple categories, 2 witnesses to a truth that most of the world had forgotten or never knew existed. I returned the gesture instinctively, my small hand mirroring its large one, and something passed between us in that moment that felt like a covenant renewed, like understanding finally bridging a gap that had existed for generations. Then it turned and moved back into the forest with that impossible grace, and I walked home clutching the wooden horse, no longer numb, no longer simply going through motions, but awake to the reality that I was part of something vast and strange and desperately important. From that night forward, I approached the offerings differently, not as duty or superstition, but as communication with an intelligence that had been trying to speak to us all along, waiting patiently across the years for someone who would finally learn to listen. My grandfather waited until the very end to tell me the whole truth, holding onto it like a man clutching a rope over a chasm, afraid that letting go would send us both tumbling into an abyss of understanding we weren't ready for. I was 16 then, sitting beside his deathbed in the room that smelled of camphor and old wood and the particular stillness that gathers round the dying, watching him struggle with words that seemed to cost him more than the cancer eating through his lungs. His hands, once so strong and steady when carving wood or mending fence, trembled as they gripped mine, and his eyes held a desperate urgency that made my throat tighten with dread. Even before he began speaking, he told me to close the door, to make sure my father couldn't hear, and when I'd done so he pulled me close with surprising strength, and whispered that everything I thought I knew about the Grey Walker was only the surface of a story that went back further than our family's presence in this valley, back to a time when the boundary between worlds was thinner and the things that walked it were both more numerous and more necessary. The offerings, he said, weren't born from fear or superstition, but from gratitude and obligation, from a debt incurred in blood and mercy on a night when the mountains themselves seemed bent on erasing our family from existence. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if finally unburdening himself of the secret gave him temporary reprieve from death's approach. And I sat transfixed, feeling the foundation of everything I'd believed shifting beneath me like thawing ice. The story he told me reached back to his own grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas, who'd come to Montana Territory in the winter of 1873 with nothing but ambition and ignorance about the land he was claiming as his own. Thomas had been a stubborn man, my grandfather said, the kind who believed that will and hard work could overcome any obstacle, who saw the wilderness as something to be tamed rather than respected, and that hubris nearly killed him and his pregnant wife during their first winter in the valley. A blizzard had come down from the mountains in late November, one of those storms that the native peoples knew to fear, the kind that erased landmarks and turned the world into a white void where direction became meaningless and cold became an active, intelligent force seeking the warmth of your life. Thomas had been caught out checking trap lines too far from the cabin when the storm hit, and within an hour he was lost, freezing, hallucinating from cold as his body began the process of shutting down. My grandfather's voice dropped even lower as he described what happened next, how Thomas had collapsed in the snow and was preparing to die when he felt something massive lift him, felt himself being carried through the howling whiteness by arms that were strong and furred and definitely not human. He drifted in and out of consciousness during that journey, catching glimpses of a gray-furred form moving through the blizzard as if it could see paths invisible to human eyes, and when he finally woke it was in a cave warmed by his own small fire, his matches and kindling carefully arranged beside him, his rifle placed within reach, alive when by all rights he should have been a frozen corpse buried under fresh snow. Thomas had stumbled back to his cabin 2 days later when the storm cleared, changed by something more than just his brush with death, and found the Grey Walker standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with those yellow-gold eyes that seemed to hold both warning and expectation. My grandfather said that Thomas understood, somehow, in a wordless way that extreme experience opens certain channels of perception, that he'd been saved for a reason, that he now owed a debt to something that stood outside the normal order of civilized life, and that debt would require acknowledgement, respect, and ongoing communication. Thomas began leaving offerings that very week, meat from his hunting, items of value, tokens that said, "I see you. I remember what you did. I will not forget." And in return the Grey Walker became a presence on the boundaries of the property, glimpsed occasionally, its tracks found near the livestock, but never any animals taken, as if it was patrolling rather than hunting. The pact was unspoken but absolute, my grandfather told me, his breathing growing more labored as the effort of the telling took its toll, and it had been passed down through for generations, because breaking it would mean more than just angering a dangerous creature. It would mean severing a connection that had kept our family safe in ways we couldn't fully measure, protected by a guardian whose vigil served purposes far greater than our small human concerns. and abandoning our part in something ancient and necessary that the modern world had forgotten, but that still held the darkness at bay. My grandfather died 3 hours after that confession. His last words a plea that I continue what Thomas had started, that I honor the covenant even when I didn't understand it, and that I watched the Grey Walker closely because it was trying to teach us something important, something we'd need to know when the time came for the burden to truly be shared. I promised him I would, holding his cooling hand as the morning light filtered through the curtains, and I felt the weight of generations settle onto my shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and solemn and strangely comforting in its solidity. Everything looked different after that. The forest less like mere wilderness and more like a territory with purpose and intelligence. The boundary of our property less like a line on a map and more like a threshold between worlds that required constant maintenance and mutual respect. I understood then why my grandfather had seemed both reverent and melancholy when speaking of the offerings, why he'd insisted on precision and consistency, and why he'd watched the tree line with an expression that mixed vigilance with something that looked almost like companionship, as if he was keeping watch alongside something, rather than merely watching for it. I continued the offerings through seasons that blurred together into a rhythm older than memory, through springs, when the mountain runoff turned our pastures to temporary marshland, and summers when the heat made the pine sap run sticky and fragrant, through autumns painted in gold and blood red, and winters that locked the valley in silence so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. The ritual became the spine of my existence, the one constant when everything else shifted and fractured and fell away, and the Grey Walker became more real to me than most of the people I knew, more present in its distant watching than the neighbors who stopped visiting when they decided I'd become strange, more reliable than the son who left for the city and called less each year, until the call stopped altogether. My wife Sarah died in the 14th year of my solitary stewardship, cancer taking her slowly enough that I had time to rage and grieve and finally accept. And through those terrible months, I would find myself walking to the offering site at odd hours, standing in the darkness speaking aloud to something I couldn't see but knew was listening. The morning after Sarah's funeral, I found a smooth river stone placed carefully on the stump where I left the offerings, gray as smoke and worn by centuries of water, and I understood it as condolence, as acknowledgement of grief from something that also knew the weight of eternal solitude, and I wept harder over that simple stone than I had at any point during the human ceremonies, with their hollow words and awkward embraces. The years taught me to read the signs the Grey Walker left like another man might read letters from a distant friend, subtle variations in the placement of tracks that indicated its mood or urgency, scratch marks on certain trees that seemed to mark territory or perhaps warn of danger I couldn't perceive, and the offerings I'd leave would sometimes be moved or ranged in patterns that felt deliberate, communicative, as if it was trying to build a vocabulary between us. I began leaving different things, testing this theory, placing tools or books or photographs alongside the meat and grain, and I'd return to find some items taken, and others left behind with careful consideration that suggested preference and meaning rather than random selection. It took the photographs of Sarah but left the ones of my son, took the compass and the hunting knife but left the pocket watch, took books about the natural world but left novels and histories, and slowly I began to understand what it valued, what resonated with its nature, what aspects of human life interested something that stood outside our normal categories of existence. On winter nights, when insomnia and loneliness became indistinguishable, I'd see its silhouette on the ridge above the house, motionless for hours, and I'd stand at the window watching it watch me, and in those shared vigils I felt less alone than I had in company, connected by purpose and recognition and the strange intimacy of parallel solitudes. The bond deepened in ways I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived this life, evolved past fear into something resembling trust or perhaps mutual respect, and I found myself unconsciously coordinating my movements with its patterns, checking my fences when I saw its tracks circling wider, bringing livestock in early when I sensed its unease, transmitted through signs too subtle for conscious recognition. There were moments of startling closeness, times when I'd be working in the far pasture and look up to find it standing at the tree line barely 30 yards away, close enough to see the silver threading through its gray fur, close enough to meet its eyes directly and see intelligence there that was neither human nor animal, but something older that contained elements of both. We'd regard each other in these encounters, communication happening in the space between heartbeats, and then it would turn and melt back into the forest with a grace that something so large shouldn't possess, leaving me standing with my heart racing and the certainty that I'd just participated in a conversation more meaningful than most I'd had with words. My neighbors thought I'd gone half mad with isolation, the eccentric hermit who talked to himself and left food in the woods, but they didn't understand that I'd found a form of companionship more honest than their social performances, a relationship built on acknowledgement and shared purpose rather than the comfortable lies that lubricate human interaction. In the 37th year of my stewardship, my son's daughter Emma came to visit, 16 and curious and carrying that particular restlessness of young people who sense there's more to the world than what they've been told. And I saw in her eyes the same quality my grandfather must have recognized in mine, the capacity to see past the surface and accept truths that don't fit comfortable categories. I took her to the offering site and told her to be silent and watch, and we stood together in the twilight as the gray walker emerged from the darkening forest, and instead of fear I saw wonder cross her face, recognition of something magnificent and terrible and necessary. The creature stopped when it saw her, head tilted in consideration, and for a long moment the three of us formed a triangle of attention. Human past and human future, and something timeless that bridged both, and I felt the burden I'd carried shift slightly, felt the possibility of continuation, of the covenant extending beyond my life into whatever came next. Emma reached for my hand without taking her eyes from the gray walker, her grip tight and trembling, but not pulling away, and I knew then that the story would go on, that the watching would continue, that the loneliness of the vigil might finally have company in its long defense against the darkness that slept and dreamed of waking. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September when the aspen leaves had turned the mountainsides to gold and the air carried that particular crispness that meant winter was gathering itself in the high places. Sheriff Donnelly's voice on the phone carried an edge I'd never heard before, careful and controlled in the way men sound when they're working hard not to panic. And he told me a family had gone missing from the National Forest campground 15 miles north of my property. Vanished sometime during the night with their tent still standing and their vehicle untouched and their campfire burned down to cold ash. They'd been reported missing by another camper who'd heard screaming around midnight, a sound he described as starting human and ending as something else entirely. And when the search parties went out at first light they'd found tracks leading away from the campsite, tracks that started as bare human feet and then changed into something that shouldn't exist. Something that measured 14 inches long with claw marks deep enough to score the hard-packed earth. Donnelly was calling me because he knew I'd spent my life in these mountains, knew I understood the wilderness in ways that weekend hikers and even experienced rangers didn't. But beneath his official request I heard the real question, the one he couldn't quite bring himself to ask directly. Had I ever seen anything that could make tracks like that? Anything that could explain what his deputies had found written in the dirt and documented in photographs that would make no sense to anyone who had to live in a world of reasonable explanations? I drove to the campsite with my stomach clenched tight and a dread rising in me like cold water, passing search parties organizing in the parking area, with their tracking dogs and their radio equipment, and their absolute confidence that this would resolve into something explainable. And when Donnelly showed me the photographs of the tracks, I felt my carefully maintained world tilt and crack. These weren't the gray walker's prints, not exactly, but they were close enough to make my hands shake as I held the images, similar in size and structure, but wrong in ways that suggested variation, rather than coincidence, a related pattern that spoke of kinship or perhaps imitation, and the wrongness of it screamed danger in a language my grandfather had taught me to understand. The tracks led north and west, deeper into the wilderness toward the old-growth forest that even hunters avoided without knowing quite why, and I could see where the search parties had followed for a mile before the trail crossed into terrain too rough for civilian volunteers, and the sheriff had called them back to regroup. I walked the perimeter of the campsite alone while Donnelly coordinated his teams, studying the signs that told a story the official reports would never capture, the way certain trees bore claw marks, too high for any bear, the pattern of disturbance that suggested something had circled the camp multiple times before approaching, and most disturbing, the complete absence of the gray walker's tracks anywhere in the area, as if it had deliberately avoided this place or been driven from it by something it recognized as threat or competition. That night I didn't leave offerings at the usual site, but instead ventured to the ridge where I'd so often seen the gray walker keeping its distant watch, and I found the place abandoned. The rock shelf where it typically stood empty except for signs of agitation, earth torn up and trees marked with gouges that spoke of rage or fear or both. I called out into the darkness, something I'd never done before, my voice small against the vastness of the mountain night, and the silence that answered felt wrong, felt like absence where there should have been presence. And for the first time in 40 years I couldn't sense the Grey Walker anywhere in its territory. The realization hit me with the force of betrayal, though I had no right to feel betrayed. The creature had broken pattern, abandoned its vigil, and something else had moved into the vacuum left behind, something that took families from their tents and left tracks that started human and became monstrous. Every assumption I'd built my life around suddenly felt fragile as spider silk, and I understood with terrible clarity that I'd been playing at comprehension, thinking I understood the rules and boundaries of our arrangement when in truth, I'd only ever seen the surface of something vast and old and far more complex than my grandfather's simple covenant could contain. I returned home in the hours before dawn and sat at my kitchen table with my grandfather's journal open before me, reading again the passages I'd memorized years ago, searching for details I might have missed or misinterpreted. And Emma found me there when she came down for breakfast. Still staying through her fall break from school, she took one look at my face and knew something had shifted, sat across from me without speaking, and waited with the patience of someone who'd already learned that some truths take time to articulate. I told Emma everything that morning as the sun rose cold and bright through the kitchen windows, the words spilling out in a rush that broke the dam of 40 years' silence. And when I finished, she didn't look at me like I was mad or diminished, but instead asked the question I'd been dreading. What are we going to do? The we in that question changed something fundamental, transformed my solitary burden into shared responsibility. And I realized that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone, that the isolation I'd worn like armor had finally cracked to let another soul inside. We packed supplies while the morning was still young, filling backpacks with water and rope and emergency gear. And I added items that wouldn't appear on any wilderness checklist: my grandfather's journal, a pouch of the dried herbs I'd been leaving as offerings, and the old rifle I'd never fired but always carried, insurance against dangers I hoped never to face. Emma asked where we were going, and I told her the truth, that I was following an instinct deeper than logic, a pull I'd felt building since the previous night that drew me north and west, toward the oldest part of the forest, the direction the strange tracks had led and the Grey Walker had seemingly fled. We left a note for Sheriff Donnelly with my neighbor, telling him where we'd gone and when to worry if we didn't return. And then we drove to the trailhead where the search parties had turned back, parking my truck in the empty lot. That felt like a threshold between the world of explanations and whatever lay beyond. The trail deteriorated within 2 miles, becoming a suggestion of passage rather than maintained path, winding through pine forest so dense the midday sun barely penetrated to the needle-carpeted floor. And I navigated by landmarks I'd learned over decades of hunting these mountains, rock formations and lightning-struck trees that served as signposts in a wilderness that resisted mapping. Emma followed without complaint, though I could see the strain in her face as the terrain grew rougher, climbing over deadfall and scrambling up slopes where erosion had carved the earth into raw channels. And twice we found signs that something large had passed this way recently, bark stripped from trees at shoulder height and the distinctive musk that meant predator, though whether the Grey Walker or something else I couldn't determine. For hours and we crested a ridge I'd never climbed before and looked down into a valley that didn't appear on any map I'd studied, a deep fold in the mountains sheltered by granite walls and filled with old-growth forest that had the primeval quality of places humans had never logged or tamed. The descent was treacherous, requiring us to rope down a cliff face where water had carved the stone into treacherous smoothness. And when we finally reached the valley floor, I felt the quality of the air change, becoming heavier, somehow, weighted with age and secrecy and the accumulated silence of centuries. We found the den an hour before sunset, tucked beneath an overhang of rock where the mountain folded back on itself to create a shelter, invisible from more than 20 feet away. And even before I saw the entrance, I knew we'd found what I'd been seeking, some instinct older than thought recognizing this place as significant. As threshold, the den entrance was wide enough for something man-sized to pass through upright, the stone worn smooth by countless passages. And just inside, where the daylight still penetrated, I saw the first of the belongings, arranged with deliberate care along a natural stone shelf. And my heart ceased in my chest, There were items I recognized from the news reports about the missing family. A child's stuffed rabbit, a man's hiking boot, a woman's jacket folded with precision, all placed carefully as if awaiting their owner's return, untouched by weather or scavengers and bearing no marks of violence. But these weren't the only artifacts, and as my eyes adjusted I saw the shelf extended deep into the cave, lined with objects that spoke of other disappearances, other tragedies, a corroded pocket watch, a woman's locket, a pair of spectacles, items spanning decades or perhaps longer, each positioned with the same meticulous care. Emma stood beside me breathing hard, her hand gripping my arm, and I heard her whisper Jesus Christ in a voice thin with horror. But I was already moving deeper, my flashlight beam sweeping the cave walls and revealing more, always more. A museum of loss ranged by some intelligence that understood the significance of personal effects, that recognized these objects as sacred remnants of human lives, the violation I'd expected to feel, the confirmation that the Grey Walker or something like it had been taking people, hunting them, dragging them to this place didn't come, because something about the arrangement spoke not of predation but of preservation, not trophies but memorials, and the careful respect evident in how each item had been placed suggested grief rather than triumph, a curator rather than a killer maintaining this collection. I was still trying to process what we'd found when I heard Emma's sharp intake of breath and turned to see her pointing deeper into the cave where my flashlight hadn't yet reached. And when I swung the beam that direction, I saw it standing in the shadows 30 feet back, motionless as stone, watching us with eyes that caught and reflected the light like mirrors, the Grey Walker, or something so similar as to be indistinguishable, its massive form filling the cave passage and blocking any retreat deeper into the mountain. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I held my ground, remembering that moment 45 years ago when I'd first seen this creature and learned that terror and violence aren't inevitable companions. And I slowly raised my hand palm forward in a gesture I hoped translated across the gap between species as peaceful intention, as recognition rather than threat. The creature remained frozen for a long moment, and I could feel its evaluation of us, its consideration of our presence in this sacred space. And then with deliberate slowness it moved, not toward us but to the side, pressing itself against the cave wall in a way that clearly communicated invitation, rather than attack, opening a path deeper into the mountain, and waiting with impatience that felt almost human in its expectation. Emma's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain, but she didn't speak, didn't question, and I understood that she'd have felt the strange communication occurring here, the sense that we'd crossed some invisible line, and were being offered a choice. Leave now with our limited understanding intact, or follow deeper and learn truths that would change everything we thought we knew about these mountains and what dwelt in their secret places. I made the choice without conscious thought, moving forward past the Grey Walker with Emma following close enough that I could feel her breath on my neck, and as we passed within arm's reach of the creature I caught its scent fully for the first time, not the carrion reek I'd expected but something clean and wild like winter wind and cedar smoke, ancient and somehow familiar, like a memory inherited rather than lived. The passage narrowed, forcing us to turn sideways in places where the stone pressed close, and I could hear the creature moving behind us with surprising silence for something so massive, its presence a weight I felt rather than heard, and the temperature dropped steadily as we descended deeper into the mountain until our breath came in visible clouds and frost sparkled on the cave walls. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber vast enough that my flashlight couldn't find the far walls, and the beam swept across formations that at first I took for stalactites before. Understanding broke over me like cold water, and I realized I was looking at bones, thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in careful piles that rose from floor to ceiling throughout the chamber. A ossuary so vast it defied comprehension, and Emma made a sound beside me that might have been a sob or a prayer or both. But these weren't human bones, and that recognition brought relief so intense it nearly buckled my knees even as new questions flooded in to replace the terror. I moved closer to the nearest pile, my light playing across skulls and femurs and rib cages, identifying species, elk and deer certainly, mountain lions and bears, wolves and coyotes, even remains of smaller predators like foxes and badgers, all cleaned and ranged with the same meticulous care as the personal effects in the outer chamber, sorted by type and size in a way that suggested purpose beyond simple collection. The Grey Walker moved past us deeper into the chamber, and I followed watching as it approached the far wall where the bones were. stacked highest. And when my light finally reached that space, I saw what it wanted me to understand. The wall itself was covered in marks, hundreds or thousands of scratches and symbols carved into the limestone with something sharp, forming patterns that looked almost like writing or perhaps pictographs. A visual language I couldn't read but recognized as communication, as record keeping, as history written by something that couldn't speak but desperately needed to be understood. The creature placed one massive clawed hand against the wall and then turned to look at me directly. And in that gaze I saw something I'd never allowed myself to believe possible. Intelligence, not just animal. Cunning but actual conscious thought, awareness. Perhaps even something approaching wisdom born from centuries of solitary vigil. And the weight of that recognition was almost more than I could bear. Emma moved to the wall before I did. Her artist's eye perhaps better equipped to decode visual language than my rancher's practicality. And she began tracing the symbols with her finger while speaking aloud the story they seemed to tell. Here something emerging from a crack in the earth. Here people fleeing. Here fire and destruction. Here the crack being sealed with rocks, and here a figure standing guard. Repeated over and over in variations that tracked the passage of seasons and years and perhaps decades. An endless vigil maintained against something that must not be allowed to emerge. The Grey Walker watched her decode its message with what I could only interpret as desperate hope. And when she turned to look at it with dawning understanding in her face, it moved again, leading us to the chamber's center where the floor dropped away into a fissure, a crack in the living rock that descended into darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. And from that opening rose a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, a wrongness that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn, the sense of something vast and malevolent sleeping far below, held back only by the stone and whatever dark bargain had been struck here long before my grandfather's time or his grandfather's. The creature knelt beside the fissure and placed both hands flat on the stone, in a gesture that looked almost like prayer or perhaps supplication. And then it looked at me again with those mirror-bright eyes, and I finally understood what my grandfather had known but couldn't speak. The offerings hadn't been payment for safe passage, but supplies for a guardian that couldn't leave its post, that spent every moment of its endless existence keeping watch over this sealed place, maintaining a vigil that protected not just my family, but every human being in the valley from whatever horror lay beneath our feet. The full weight of what I was witnessing crashed over me as the Grey Walker rose and moved to the far side of the chamber where bones had been arranged into something like a nest or perhaps a bed, a place of rest it clearly used during whatever brief moments it allowed itself to sleep. And beside that nest I saw more artifacts, tools, made from antler and stone, marks on the wall that tracked phases of the moon and changing seasons, the infrastructure of a life lived in complete isolation for purposes that transcended any single life, time, or generation. This creature wasn't some mindless beast hunting at the edges of human civilization, but a prisoner of duty, cursed or chosen to stand eternal watch over a boundary between worlds, maintaining a vigil so old it had passed into legend and then been forgotten entirely, except as whispered warnings and midnight fears. And the offerings my family had left weren't tribute to a predator, but the only connection this being had to the world above, small acknowledgments that it hadn't been completely abandoned to its solitary fate. Emma was crying silently beside me, tears tracking down her face as she too grasped the magnitude of what we'd found. And when she spoke, her voice was raw with emotion. How long has it been here? How long has it been alone? And the question hung in the cold air unanswered because the honest response would have been decades, or centuries, or perhaps since before human memory began recording such things. And span of isolation so vast it exceeded comprehension. The Grey Walker turned from its nest and approached me directly for the first time, moving with deliberate slowness until it stood close enough to touch. And then it did something I never expected. It placed one massive hand over its chest where a human heart would be, then extended that same hand toward me in a gesture so clearly communicative. It transcended language, and I understood it was asking something, offering something, attempting to bridge a gap that had existed for longer than either of us had been alive. I reached out with trembling fingers and placed my hand over my own chest, mirroring the gesture, then extended it toward the creature. And the moment our hands met, I felt a shock of recognition so profound it seemed to stop time itself, not pain but connection, a sudden awareness of the immense weight of centuries pressing down on this being, the accumulated loneliness of endless nights standing watch while the world above changed and forgot, and moved on without it. The Grey Walker's hand was surprisingly warm despite the cold radiating from the fissure. The pads rough but not threatening, and it held my gaze with an intensity that felt like communication beyond words, like it was willing me to understand something essential. And in that moment I saw reflected in those mirror-bright eyes not a monster, but a soul as burdened and weary as any human who'd carried too much for too long. Emma moved beside me and placed her own hand on the creature's arm, a gesture of solidarity or perhaps comfort, and the Grey Walker's eyes shifted to her, briefly before returning to me, and I realized with sudden clarity what it was asking. Not for rescue because there could be none, not for release because the vigil couldn't end, but simply for witness, for someone to finally understand that it existed not as legend or nightmare, but as a living being who'd sacrificed everything to protect those who'd forgotten it ever existed. The creature moved back to the wall and began pointing to specific symbols, and Emma translated haltingly as the story emerged. The thing below had come from somewhere else, somewhere outside or beneath or beyond normal reality, and it had tried to enter this world through the fissure, drawn by human presence or perhaps hunger or simple alien desire. And the people who'd lived here then had fought it with fire and iron and finally sealed it away. But the seal required constant maintenance, a guardian who would know if the stone shifted or the wrongness below began to wake. The Grey Walker touched a symbol that showed a human figure and a creature standing together, and then a symbol showing the human aging and dying while the creature remained unchanged. And I understood the devastating truth. Whoever or whatever had placed this being here had made it immortal or at least vastly long-lived, condemning it to watch generation after generation of humans live and die while it remained frozen in duty, unable to age or leave or find peace. Emma's voice broke as she read the final sequence, symbols showing the creature watching human settlements from a distance, following families, learning their patterns, trying to maintain some connection to the world it protected but could never rejoin. And the offerings my family had left weren't just supplies but proof that someone still remembered, that its sacrifice hadn't been rendered completely invisible by the passage of time. The Grey Walker's shoulders sagged as we read its history, as if the act of being understood had allowed it to finally acknowledge the weight it carried. And when it turned back to face us, I saw something glistening on its face that might have been tears or perhaps just moisture from the cave's dampness. But I chose to believe the former because the alternative was too cruel to contemplate. The creature moved to the fissure and gestured for us to approach, and though every instinct screamed against getting closer to that source of wrongness, I forced myself forward, Emma matching me step for step. And when we reached the edge, the Grey Walker pointed down into the darkness, and then to the walls around us. And I finally saw what I'd missed before. The entire chamber was reinforced. Massive stones wedged into cracks, smaller rocks filling gaps, even what looked like deliberately collapsed sections creating barriers, all of it maintained by hand over impossible spans of time. The creature touched the stone and then touched its chest again, and the message was unmistakable. I am the seal. I am the barrier. I am what stands between what sleeps below and everyone above. And if I fail or fall or abandon my post, then everything and everyone in this valley, and perhaps beyond, will pay the price for that failure. Emma made a sound like a sob and asked the question I couldn't voice. Why you? Why does it have to be you? Why can't someone else take over or share the burden? And the Grey Walker shook its head slowly and pointed to symbols on the wall that showed attempts to leave. Attempts that had resulted in the stone weakening and the wrongness below stirring, proving that whatever magic or curse or duty bound this creature to its vigil couldn't be transferred or shared, only maintained until the end of time or the end of the guardian, whichever came first. I thought of my grandfather's deathbed confession, his insistence that the offerings continue, and understood now that he'd known or suspected the truth and had tried in his limited way to ensure this being wouldn't be completely abandoned, that some thread of connection would remain even if the full story had been lost. And the weight of that inherited responsibility settled over me like a physical burden as I realized I now stood at a threshold where ignorance was no longer possible, and action of some kind had become unavoidable. The Grey Walker moved back to its nest and retrieved something I hadn't noticed before, a leather pouch so old it was nearly petrified, and from this it withdrew objects that it laid out on the stone floor with reverent care, and I recognized them as human artifacts: a knife with a bone handle, a copper bracelet green with age, a small carved figure that might have been a child's toy, a lock of dark hair, bound with sinew, personal effects from the person who'd first stood watch with this creature, or Perhaps the person who'd placed it here, mementos of a connection so old it preceded written history. The creature touched each item gently before looking at me again, and in that gesture I understood another layer of its message. I was human once, or I knew humans once, or I loved humans once, and I have been so alone for so long that I have nearly forgotten what connection feels like. And you are the first in generations to see me as something other than monster or myth. Emma knelt beside the artifacts and asked permission with a gesture, before touching the carved figure, and the Grey Walker nodded, and when she lifted it I saw her face crumble with emotion as she recognized the craftsmanship as Native American, older than any reservation or treaty, from a time when this land had different names and different peoples, and the temporal weight of what we were witnessing became almost unbearable. I found myself speaking without planning, the words, telling the Grey Walker that I saw it, that I understood, that its vigil hadn't been invisible or meaningless, and I promised that the offerings would continue and that I would find some way to acknowledge its existence, beyond simple ritual. And as I spoke I watched something shift in its expression, a softening or perhaps a breaking, as if hearing words of recognition after centuries of silence had finally allowed it to acknowledge its own loneliness. The creature reached out and placed its hand on my shoulder, not threatening but gentle, almost grateful. And then it did something that shattered whatever remained of my emotional composure. It bowed its head to me, in a gesture of respect or perhaps equality, acknowledging me as witness and perhaps something more. And I understood that I had become part of its vigil, whether I'd chosen to or not, bound by knowledge and understanding into a partnership that would define whatever time I had remaining in this world. The Grey Walker rose from its bough and moved to the deepest part of the cave where shadows pooled, so thick they seemed solid, and it began clearing away loose stones from what I'd assumed was just another wall until a new opening emerged, smaller and older than the rest. And beyond it I could see something that made my breath catch, more symbols, but these ones glowing faintly, with a phosphorescence that had nothing to do with natural light, ranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes couldn't quite process what they were seeing. The creature gestured for us to stay back and entered this inner sanctum alone, moving with reverence that bordered on ritual, and when it emerged it carried something wrapped in hide, so ancient it crumbled slightly at the edges, and it brought this bundle to me with both hands extended like an offering or perhaps a burden, being transferred. Emma whispered a warning, but I was already reaching out, compelled by something deeper than curiosity, and when the Grey Walker placed the bundle in my hands, I felt the weight of it physically and metaphorically, heavier than its size suggested. And when I carefully unwrapped the hide I found a book or journal, the pages made from some kind of treated leather, covered in writing I couldn't read, but that Emma immediately recognized as multiple languages, indigenous scripts mixed with early colonial text, a palimpsest of witnesses who'd encountered this creature across centuries. The creature pointed to the book and then to me, and the meaning struck like lightning. This was the record, the testament of those who'd known the truth. And I was being asked to add my voice to this accumulated history, to become part of a chain of understanding that stretched back before my family's time in this valley, before the valley even had the name we'd given it, a lineage of witnesses who'd chosen to see guardian rather than monster. I opened the book with trembling hands and found the first entry, dated 1847 in shaky English script. It watches still, whatever it is, and I have decided to leave offerings as my wife's people taught me, for it has harmed no one, and the elk return to this valley in numbers I have never seen elsewhere, and I believe it keeps worse things away. The entries continued sporadically, different hands and different languages, some just a few words, others detailed accounts of sightings and interactions, and a pattern emerged. Every person who'd written in this book had reached the same conclusion, that the Grey Walker was protection rather than threat, guardian rather than predator, and each had committed to maintaining contact and bearing witness to its vigil. I found an entry from 1923 that made my throat tighten, my grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable, describing an encounter where he'd fallen through ice on the North Creek and the creature had pulled him out and carried him to shelter, and his words captured something I recognized from his deathbed confession. I don't know what it is or what it guards against, but I know gratitude when I feel it, and I will honor this being as long as I draw breath. Emma read over my shoulder and pointed to the final entry, dated 15 years ago in handwriting I didn't recognize, and the words were haunting. I am dying and there is no one to tell, no one who would believe or understand. And I fear this valley will forget and the offerings will stop. And this lonely creature will face eternity with no proof that its sacrifice matters to anyone. The Grey Walker watched me read with an intensity that felt like hope and fear combined, and I understood that this book represented everything: proof of its existence beyond myth, evidence of its purpose, and most crucially, documentation that it had been seen and valued and remembered across the vast expanse of its vigil. And without this record, it might have dissolved entirely into legend or madness, its reality erased by the simple fact that nothing should be able to endure so long in such isolation. The creature gestured to the glowing symbols in the inner chamber, and Emma moved closer to examine them, her academic training overriding her fear. And after several minutes of study, she turned to me with a face drained of color and said the symbols weren't just decorative but functional, a kind of ongoing ritual or spell that had to be maintained. And the Grey Walker wasn't just guarding the seal but actively participating in it, feeding its own life force into the barrier to keep the wrongness below contained. She pointed out patterns in the symbols that repeated, cycles that suggested renewal and sacrifice, and the devastating mathematics became clear. The creature was trapped in a loop where its existence sustained the seal, and the seal required its existence. A perfect circle of obligation that could only end if the thing below was destroyed or the guardian was. And neither option seemed possible given what we'd learned. The Grey Walker confirmed this with a gesture that encompassed the chamber and then itself, a shrug that was both resigned and defiant. And I saw in that moment the full scope of what it meant to be the last of its kind. Not just loneliness but impossibility, being the only thing standing between catastrophe and normalcy, with no hope of relief or replacement, carrying knowledge that it would never be free and never be fully understood, but continuing anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. I asked the question that had been building since we'd entered this place: how long? How many years have you been here? And the creature moved to the wall and pointed to symbols Emma translated as before the ice retreated, before the first peoples, before memory. And the temporal abyss that opened with those words was vertigo-inducing, suggesting this being had maintained its vigil not for centuries, but for millennia, watching human civilization rise from nothing and spread across a continent while it remained frozen in duty at this single point, this one vital threshold between worlds that no one above even knew existed anymore. The Grey Walker returned to me and placed one hand on the journal and the other on my chest, and its eyes held mine with an intensity that felt like a question and a plea combined, and I understood what it was asking. Will you continue the witness? Will you add your voice to this record? Will you ensure that when I finally end, however, and whenever that comes, someone will know that I existed, and that my vigil mattered, that I was not just myth or nightmare, but a living being who gave everything to protect those who never knew they needed protection? Emma stood beside me and placed her hand over mine on the journal, and together we nodded, and I saw something break in the creature's expression, a dam of emotion held back for so long that its release seemed to physically diminish it, and it sank to its knees with a sound that was part exhalation and part sob, and I found myself kneeling with it, this legendary terror of my childhood, and placing my hand on its shoulder in comfort, because what else could I do when faced with suffering so vast and so undeserved? I made a promise in that cave, witnessed by Emma and the bones and the glowing symbols and the wrongness that pulsed beneath us, that I would tell this story, that I would maintain the offerings, that I would find others who could understand and share the burden of witness, and that the Grey Walker would never again face its vigil in complete isolation. And as I spoke these words, I saw something I never expected to see in those mirror-bright eyes: hope, fragile and uncertain but undeniably present, the first crack in the armor of resignation that had sustained this creature through ages of loneliness. And I knew then that my life had pivoted around this moment, that I could never return to simple ranching and simple routines knowing what I now knew, that I had been conscripted into something ancient and vital, and terrifying and somehow holy, bound to a guardian at the edge of reality by nothing more than understanding and the basic human need to ensure that no being, however strange, should face eternity alone. I left the cave that night transformed, carrying the journal like a holy relic pressed against my chest, and Emma walked beside me in silence that spoke of shared purpose. And when we emerged into the ordinary night with its ordinary stars, I felt the weight of two worlds pressing against each other, the simple ranching life I'd known, and this deeper reality that had always existed beneath it, waiting for me to finally see. The Grey Walker followed us to the boundary of its territory and watched as we descended toward the distant lights of my ranch, and I turned back once to see it standing there framed against the darkness, and I raised my hand in acknowledgement, and it mirrored the gesture, and something passed between us that transcended species and time, a recognition that we were now bound together in purpose, guardian and witness, lonely sentinel and the human who would ensure its vigil was remembered. I spent 3 days writing my entry in that ancient journal, trying to capture everything we'd experienced and everything I'd understood, and my words joined the accumulated testimony of witnesses stretching back to times when this land had different names and different peoples. And when I finished, I wrapped the journal carefully and returned it to the cave where the gray walker accepted it with reverence, and I watched as it carried the book back to the inner chamber where the glowing symbols pulsed their eternal warning. This creature maintaining its impossible duty while now knowing that someone above understood and valued what it sacrificed. The months that followed were the strangest of my life, continuing the surface routines of ranch work while carrying the weight of knowledge that would sound like madness if I spoke it to anyone who hadn't witnessed what Emma and I had seen. And I found myself looking at my land differently, seeing it not just as property, but as the top layer of something deeper, a threshold territory between the ordinary world and the sealed wrongness that pulsed beneath the mountains. And my cattle grazed in ignorance above barriers maintained by a creature most would call monster, their peaceful existence purchased by a guardian's eternal sacrifice that they would never know to appreciate. Emma returned to her university, but we spoke weekly, and she began careful research into indigenous accounts and early settler reports, finding patterns that suggested the Grey Walker's kind had once existed in other places, other guardians maintaining other seals, but now likely extinct or dormant or perhaps still watching from hidden territories we dismissed as wilderness, a worldwide network of protection that had decayed to isolated remnants like the one in my valley. I made my offerings more regularly now, not just the traditional times but whenever I felt moved to connect, and sometimes I would sit at the boundary and wait, and the Grey Walker would emerge and we would regard each other in silence that felt like conversation, to beings from different worlds maintaining a vigil together. And I swear, it seemed less burdened during those moments, as if being seen and understood provided relief that nothing else could offer. My nephew Michael came to learn the ranch last spring, a good kid who'd lost his direction in the city and wanted to try working with his hands, and I saw in him something I recognized from my younger self, a readiness to see beyond the obvious if given reason to look. And I made the decision my grandfather had made with me, to pass down the truth rather than let it die with my generation. I took him to the boundary and told him everything, showing him the journal entries and the carefully maintained offering sites. And when he asked to see the creature, I called out in the way I'd learned, and the Grey Walker emerged from the tree line like a materialization of legend. And Michael's fear was real, but so was his wonder, and I watched him cycle through the same transformation I had experienced, from terror to curiosity to understanding. And when he asked what he should do, I told him the same thing my grandfather had told me: bear witness, maintain contact, and ensure that this guardian is never forgotten, that its sacrifice is honored by those who benefit from it whether they know it or not. The Grey Walker approached closer than it ever had before and studied Michael with those mirror-bright eyes, and something passed between them, some recognition or acceptance, and I knew then that the chain of witness would continue, that the burden would be shared across another generation, and the creature seemed to stand taller as if this assurance provided strength that centuries of isolation had drained away. I am old now and I feel the years pressing close, but I face my ending without fear because I know the vigil will continue, that Michael understands and will find someone else when his time comes, and the Grey Walker will not face eternity alone, as it had before my grandfather's first hesitant offering. And in the quiet moments before sleep, I think about that creature standing watch in the deep places, feeding its life force into barriers against wrongness, sacrificing everything for a world that has forgotten why such guardians were ever needed. And I am humbled by the weight of such dedication, such lonely honor. The ranching life continues in its cycles, cattle moving through seasons, grass growing and dying and growing again. But beneath it all pulses this deeper truth, this ancient bargain between human witness and inhuman guardian. And I have learned that the most profound duties are often the most hidden, that protection sometimes wears a monstrous face, and that the distance between nightmare and savior is often just a matter of understanding whose side the creature stands on and what it has given up to stand there. When I make my offerings now, I speak words of gratitude aloud, thanking the Grey Walker not just for what it protects us from, but for its endurance, for continuing despite isolation and burden and the terrible knowledge that its vigil may never end. And I like to think those words matter, that after millennia of silence and fear it can finally hear acknowledgement and appreciation from the beings it guards, and that this small gift of recognition provides sustenance that meat alone never could. The valley remains peaceful, and my cattle graze in safety, and somewhere in the deep forest the last of its kind maintains the barrier between worlds, and I sleep soundly knowing that the Guardian is no longer alone in its understanding, that the chain of witness holds strong, and that when I am gone the offerings will continue and the story will be told, and the Grey Walker will face its eternal duty with the comfort of knowing that it is seen and valued and remembered, which is perhaps all any of us, human or otherwise, can ask from this brief transit through existence. What would you do if you discovered something ancient was protecting you all along? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of what we think we know.